Hello, my name is Tom Walski with Bentley Systems, and I'm here in my capacity as a member of the committee documenting the history of water distribution system analysis as part of EWRI. Today is October 12th, 2015, and I'm here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania with Joe Kroon, who is one of the early innovators and implementers of water distribution system modeling. So we're going to get Joe's perspective on the evolution of distribution system analysis. So we'll start off with the first question here, Joe, is how did you get involved with water distribution system analysis in the first place?
So Tom, first of all, let me thank you for this project. It's a great opportunity and sent me down memory lane thinking about the things that I was involved in back in the early days. How did I get involved? Well, I didn't start in water distribution system analysis. My undergraduate degree was actually in civil engineering, but with a structural engineering emphasis, and my first job was designing heavy steel structures for electric power generating plant in Michigan. While I was there, less than a year into that job, the 3 Mile Island accident happened. That was the big nuclear meltdown accident in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Well, the company I'd been working for, more than half their work was designing nuclear power plants, and of course within days of the accident all of that work shut down. The company was in pretty severe distress, and I needed something else to do. So I looked about. I realized already at that point that I didn't want to be a structural engineer, and I found that the University of Michigan, in their hydraulics program, was offering a scholarship. It was based on the estate of a guy named Ernest Broder, who had written a book called Handbook of Hydraulics back in the 30s, I think. And University of Michigan still had scholarship money coming from that source. So I met with Ben Wiley, and he offered me the scholarship, and so I went back to school to get a graduate degree in civil engineering again, but with an emphasis on hydrology and hydraulics. I thought that I was going to specialize in hydrology and river flows and harbor design. But after taking Ben Wiley's class on pipeline hydraulics, I kind of got hooked on the other side of the profession, closed conduit hydraulics. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to study under Ben Wiley. I didn't study under Vic Streeter. He had retired at that point, but he was still active. Still had an office at the engineering building at U of M. And was in those days playing around with this device called an Apple II. This was in 1979, so he was really one of the very early users of that system. Now, while I was at U of M, there was a guy named Mike Stoner who had graduated a few years earlier. He did his PhD work under Streeter and Wiley. And he had this small startup software company in Carlisle, Pennsylvania called Stoner Associates. He went back to Michigan every year to do recruiting to bring new people into his company. And I got referred to him by Ben Wiley, and we met, and Mike was very enthusiastic. Seemed like joining a small software company might be kind of a fun thing to do. I actually turned down an offer to work for one of the largest pipeline companies in the country, Colonial Pipeline in Atlanta. Live in Atlanta, live in a small town in Pennsylvania. It was the software side of it that really pulled me in, which was a little strange because I really didn't have any formal training in software development. I took the standard Fortran training class that all engineers had to take back then, but that was it. So ironically, I wound up leaving my first job because of 3 Mile Island, and then going to work for a company 25 miles away from 3 Mile Island, on the upwind side. So I felt it was all right.
And so how did Stoner evolve into a lot of the products that they had? You got into both steady state hydraulics, unsteady, transients?
So, good question. Stoner Associates, really their core business back then was with natural gas distribution systems. Mike Stoner's PhD work when he was at Michigan was working with Streeter and Wiley developing natural gas distribution networks steady state analysis program. It was called GASSS for gas steady state. And that came first. The algorithms that were built into GASSS were then applied to water distribution system modeling, and that resulted in a product called LIQSS for liquid steady state. Liquid, not water steady state, because it could be used for pipelines carrying any kind of liquid, although really it was only water that it was ever used for very much. Although Mike Stoner did use his LIQSS program to analyze the water network that was feeding the new hot tub that he was putting in at his house. That was one of the interesting projects to be involved in the early days. In addition to the steady state programs, Stoner had two transient state programs. Their gas program was called GASUS for gas unsteady state, and then LIQT for liquid transients. So those were the four initial software offerings that Stoner Associates had. And when I joined, I was specifically hired to work on the LIQT, the liquid transient program. I started at Stoner the day that David Goldberg left, I think to go back to U of M at that point. And he'd done a lot of the early development of the LIQT program. So I came on to do liquid transients, and it wasn't long before I was also working on the LIQSS program for modeling water distribution networks.
Well, how did your work split up between, say, software development and application to studies? Did you start off doing mostly development and get into more applications, or how did that work?
Interesting. Actually, when I first joined the company, I joined two companies. Mike had split into two different companies, Stoner Associates for the software and Stoner Consulting for the application consulting work. I believe it was because he wanted to keep his intellectual property separate from a company that was providing consulting services. So I actually I was paid half by one company and half by the other company, and carried two sets of business cards. But I spent most of my time early on doing software development work, and it was all in Fortran, and it was all initially on mainframe computers through time sharing, working on a teletype terminal and accessing the mainframe. By I think it was maybe the early to mid 80s, Mike Stoner invested in a mini computer from Prime Computing, and that allowed us to bring all of our development work in-house. I was still doing mostly software development, although gradually over time that started to shift toward doing more consulting work, particularly on water hammer type studies. By the mid-80s, I'd done enough water hammer studies that I was becoming somewhat of an expert at it, and a couple of times was asked to serve as an expert witness for pipeline failure events, which was always an interesting experience, although I never got to see the inside of a courtroom because they always settled out of court. The business around the transient analysis program was fairly different from the business around the water network analysis program. For the transient analysis, that required a degree of expertise, and it was only needed very occasionally by anybody. So we tended not to sell licenses to the software. Instead, we tended to use it ourselves and perform consulting studies. So I did a lot of that type of work. In the water distribution area, it was kind of the opposite. Mostly we were selling licenses to the software. Weren't really using it to do any sort of engineering design work, but we had a pretty big business in developing the models, starting out with paper maps and extracting all of the information about the pipes and the valves and pumps and the topology, and building the digital model, which we would then hand over to either the consulting engineering firm or directly to the utility, and then they would use it themselves rather than us using it on their behalf. So gradually over time I got more involved in in doing consulting work, doing building of large models, and then started to get into more of a managerial role. And I really stopped doing software development about the time that graphical user interfaces were coming around. I only ever worked in Fortran, so that tells you about how old and out of date my software development skills are.
Okay. Yeah, and Stoner software, you were one of the last people who had a physical dongle as a licensing tool, right?
Oh yes, I remember that now. Yeah,
So,
because we were a commercial company and we had to protect our software intellectual property. Yeah, the early security methods made use of a dongle that would attach in a parallel port between the printer and the parallel port on the back of the computer. And all of that is ancient technology
That's
at this
right.
point, of course.
yeah, but that's part of the history that we're trying to capture here, yes.
Yeah. I also built a physical model of a water transmission pipeline. It was made from, I think, maybe 1/4-inch diameter plastic tubing. I believe there was maybe 50 or 100 feet of this plastic tubing with a bucket of water for the water supply, a small electric pump, and some pressure gauges and a couple of solenoid activated valves at either end. And we could fill the thing with water, get the pipe full of water, turn the pump on, and then by snapping closed the pump or the valve at the downstream end, we could watch the gauges, and you could see the water hammer move from one end to the other. Or if we snapped the upstream valve closed, we were actually getting column separation, which you could see because the plastic pipe was translucent, and you could see the cavity forming. The first version was a spool with this pipe wrapped around it, and the valve laying here and the pumps laying there, and it was kind of an experiment in the basement. And then I managed to get it all into a wooden box. I made the box myself and painted it with the colors of the Stoner Associates logo. And it sat maybe, I don't know, 18 inches tall by 24 inches square. Inside was the coil of this plastic pipe with a bucket of water in the middle and a hole in the top so we could fill and empty the bucket. And all of the other equipment, the pump and the valves and the pressure gauges, were all mounted on the surface of the box. And I took that thing on the road with me to demonstrate water hammer as a way of trying to interest sales of the LIQT product or consulting services.
I think I may have even seen that at a conference or something one time.
You probably did.
Yeah,
it showed up at a number of AWWA and probably some ASCE conferences over the years.
Well, that's really cool. So among the studies you did, any particular ones stand out to you as being especially memorable? How many studies did you work on, first of all, I guess would be like
dozens
at least dozens.
Yeah. There is one that stands out.
Okay.
And it was a water quality analysis study. The city of Tucson approached us, actually attorneys for plaintiffs for the city of Tucson approached us. They had discovered that part of the distribution network for the city of Tucson had been pulling in groundwater contaminated with trichloroethylene for quite a few years. And in certain parts of the city there were pockets of very high incidence of cancers and various other kinds of diseases. Turns out that back in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s there were a number of aircraft parts manufacturers located kind of in the area where Tucson Airport is today. And they would use TCE to clean oil and grease off of parts they were manufacturing, and would literally just dump it into open pits on their property, and it seeped into the groundwater. Tucson's served by groundwater wells located throughout the area, and certain of those wells became pretty heavily contaminated with TCE. As I said, we were approached by attorneys, plaintiffs for a group of people who were suing the water utility because of all of this. And we built a very detailed model of the distribution network. We worked with another company that was modeling the groundwater flows, and they would give us what they thought were the likely contamination concentrations at the wells over the years. And then we had to build multiple models of the distribution network to represent what it looked like. Let's say, I forget the years, but let's say 1950, 1955, 1960 as the system built out. We would run basically propagation studies to determine where the water from the contaminated wells was being delivered. And as it turns out, it was being delivered exactly to those parts of the city where people were experiencing high rates of cancer and other diseases. So and once again, I thought that maybe I would finally get to testify in a courtroom, but it got settled out of court. But not before I had to give a day-long deposition to the defendant's attorney. Remember Ken Starr, the guy that was involved in the Bill Clinton?
Yeah.
His former partner was the guy who deposed me, and it was one of the most grueling days of my life, I can tell you.
Yeah, those things are really tough at times. Well, was this before or after Woburn, Massachusetts? Remember?
Good question. So, yes, it was right at about the same time. It might have been just a little bit afterwards, but yes, there was a book written about the situation in Woburn. That also involved contamination of drinking water with TCE, and there was a book written about it, and then a movie was made starring John Travolta as the dashing attorney who took on very, very similar parallels, almost identical, except that I think in Woburn it was W.R. Grace was the defendant in that situation, and in Tucson it was Hughes Aircraft was the main defendant. I wish I could say there was a dashing young
you could have John Travolta playing you in the movie.
No,
not quite.
The guy who did the water distribution system analysis for Woburn, he never showed up in the movie. His character never showed up in the movie.
No, the lawyers get the credit when the engineers do the work. That's typically the way it works. And they get paid a lot more too, usually. Yeah. So Stoner Associates itself doesn't really exist anymore. Anything about the history of how that evolved into so many other companies and the software got spread around?
Stoner Associates has to be one of the most traded companies. When I joined back in 1980, there were about a dozen people, so it really was still kind of in the early startup phase. By the mid-'80s, I don't recall the year, maybe 85, let's say, Mike Stoner was ready to retire, so he sold the company to Philadelphia Suburban Corporation, which is now, I think, called Aqua America, or owned by Aqua America. So Philadelphia Suburban then owned Stoner Associates for a few years, and then they sold the company to Severn Trent Water, one of the big UK water utilities. Severn Trent Water then sold Stoner Associates to a company called Advanica, which until just a few months prior to that, and this was in 2002, had been the engineering division of British Gas. British Gas spun their engineering division out into a separate company, called it Advanica. They acquired Stoner Associates. About a year later, Advanica was sold to National Grid, the British electricity transmission company, which also owns some electricity distribution utilities in the United States. I kind of lost track at that point, because the sale of Advanica to National Grid is when I left the company, and not long after that I joined Bentley.
Okay.
But National Grid doesn't own them anymore either. They went to a German company, and I believe they've now transferred again to yet another owner, so I lost track. I wasn't counting.
GL something was one of them, I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of legacy behind those models. That go. Did you ever get to work on gas models at all, or did you?
I did, to the extent that, so in the early years, there was no organization because the company was so small. So everybody did everything. It was one of those situations. I was doing software development, consulting, training, documentation, sales, you name it. Everybody had to join in on everything. Eventually we organized ourselves into two divisions, one serving the gas industry and one serving the water and the liquids industry, which was primarily water. And I was responsible for the liquids side of the business. Then we reorganized again into a sales group, a software development group, and a professional services group. And I had responsibility for the professional services group, which covered both gas and water. And at that point, we also then had an electric distribution modeling package. So I did get involved in the gas side of the business because for about 7 years I was responsible for all of the consulting and model building work we were doing across all industries.
So you were vice president or something? That was your title, or did you have all kind of different hats you wore?
Yeah, well, like I said, when I first started at Stoner those many years ago, I wore a half a dozen different hats, and then became more focused on the professional services side of the business. In '91, I became vice president of professional services at Stoner. In '98, I became president of the company when the then existing president left the company. Then we got acquired by Advanica, and I became president of all of Advanica. Then we got acquired by National Grid, and I left the company at that point and joined Bentley not too long after that. Within a few months of joining Bentley, I was vice president of professional services, and that's what I am today. So most of my career, except for the very early days when I was doing Fortran software development, has been more focused on consulting, professional services, model building, those sorts of activities.
Yeah, so for a guy who's done as much, you haven't really published much in the professional literature. Do you just not care about that sort of thing? Because a lot of the people we're interviewing have, resumes about 10 inches thick or so.
I published a lot in the 80s and into the 90s. I think I might have a couple of dozen papers to my credit, usually with co-authors. But once I started taking on much more of a managerial responsibility in the mid-90s, I kind of pulled away from that a bit. Just didn't have time anymore.
Did you guys get much into optimization at all?
We dabbled in it. I had a real interest in neural network technology when it was first coming on the scene. I thought it might be a good method, particularly for demand forecasting, which is, I think, one of the prerequisites to doing optimization. You have to know what your demands are going to be. But that was also right about the time that I was transitioning more into a managerial role, so I never saw it through to anything concrete. I think if I had stayed more in a technical role, I would have carried that further than I did. But speaking of optimization, that's a tricky one. As I'm sure you know from your own career, operators just don't like to be told how to run their system. And more than that, they don't like to let their reservoirs and tanks drop below a certain level, which is, and that certain level being almost full, right? In order to optimize energy use and schedule pumps to run at night when prices are low, energy rates are lower, you have to make better use of your storage capacity in your system, and system operators tend to not want to do that. They're very risk averse. Although I remember one incident with a UK water utility, I won't mention the name, at one point decided that they were going to offer financial incentive to their systems operators to try to reduce pump energy use. You can probably guess what happened. Their tanks were running dry at very inopportune times, and they realized that the law of unintended consequences had gotten a hold of them. It wasn't long before they removed that incentive, and the operators were once again keeping the tanks full. So
that's a good one. Okay, so this has been some great information you provided us. Do you have any kind of summary remarks about how the history has evolved over your career?
It evolved very rapidly, certainly in the 80s and on into the 90s when I was very much involved. And it was a fun time to be in the profession, to see that fast evolution happening, not coincidentally at the same time that computing power was becoming cheaper and more widespread. Not having been in the profession really since, I'd say, the mid-90s, it's been basically 20 years since I've had any sort of detailed involvement. But participating in these interviews has really been fun for me to remember all the things that took place, and to take a look again at what's happening in the profession. And I'm sure that things have advanced considerably since I had my involvement, and probably still has a long way to go, I'll bet.
Yeah, I can remember once making a statement that we pretty much had developed everything we needed, and this was like 20 years ago. People laugh at me.
It's dangerous to make those
kinds
of
yes. Okay, Joe. Well, thanks a lot for your time, and this was excellent. It really fills in a nice gap we have in our interviews, and so thank you for spending the time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.